6 days into his premiership, on the White House balcony, Keir Starmer and his wife savouring the moment. There was a gala dinner to mark 75 years of Nato. Today, Asia-Pacific allies were invited in to meet with Nato. A late start as everyone waited for Joe Biden to arrive. Italy's Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni couldn't hide her frustration. Turkey's President Erdogan appeared to have skipped breakfast. NATO's communiqué labelled China as a decisive enabler of Russian aggression. This summit also saw NATO promise Ukraine an irreversible path to membership. But President Zelensky knows a new resident here could render that language and many other pledges meaningless.
We greatly appreciate your decisions to strengthen our air defense, the 5 new Patriots and other dozens of other systems. And we have, and I want also to speak today how we can continue to support.
The United States must never be like Putin's Russia. We don't empower dictators. We don't.
The Biden campaign chose this moment to release a re-election ad, ramming home Donald Trump's links to Russia. One NATO head of government, Hungary's Viktor Orban, is heading straight from here to Florida to see his ally, Donald Trump.
Come on in, man.
Number 10 made a memento of Keir Starmer's visit to the Oval Office, which came just after England qualified for the Euros final.
England! We got the finals.
Keir Starmer today said he found President Biden alert throughout his meeting last night.
Because we had a long conversation on the phone. When you won, give me your hand there, pal. And we're the best of allies maybe in the whole world.
President Biden sounded like a man pleased to have a new government in Britain that wants to get closer to the EU.
I kind of see you guys as the knot tying the transatlantic alliance together.
The government said ahead of talks on a European defence and security pact, Britain might try to join some specific EU defence projects much quicker. But for many in America, this entire summit is a moment to decide if Joe Biden is the right man to hold off Donald Trump and whatever could follow a second Trump election. His every word and move will be watched later tonight when the president holds a press conference, which he said will be a moment Americans can judge his sharpness. Keir Starmer's heading home tonight to an overflowing in-tray of trouble. Before he left Washington, I caught up with him and I started by asking him about how, given his modest campaign pledges, he's actually going to deal with what he and his ministers are now calling the shocking state of the public realm and the public finances. You've been talking about the 2.5% of GDP you want spent on defence at some future point. There's some puzzlement back home about how, if you're going to have a review and then work out the date that you're going to hit it, and yet you're going to have a spending review before that. So you're going to decide the envelope, and yet somehow you're going to stretch the envelope a bit later. It doesn't quite tally.
The commitment to 2.5% is absolute, and we will get to that 2.5%. It is very important. We need to do that within our fiscal rules. I think that actually underscores the seriousness of what we're doing. If I was to sit here and say to you, we're going to hit 2.5%, I'm going to pick an arbitrary date, I'm not going to tell you how we're going to afford it, you would say that's an unserious plan.
But it seems unserious if you're going into a spending review and deciding the entire cash envelope and you haven't worked out when you're intending to hit the 2.5. There won't be enough money for defence, or you have to scrape it out of something else you don't want to scrape it out of.
We'll meet it within our fiscal rules. Obviously, we will go through that exercise. There is the strategic review as well, which is looking at the risks and the capabilities.
But they're out of kilter, these two things.
We've now got access to material that we understandably and rightly didn't have access to before we were in government. So we carry out that strategic review. The commitment to 2.5% is the commitment. It's the commitment that we have made as a government, that I have made. But we need a clear pathway to it. And that is what you would expect from a serious government.
You get my point. These things are not tied up properly. But can I ask you about, you say you're now getting to seriously see the books and that sort of thing. We heard Rachel Reeves on Monday. Some people would say sort of pearl-clutching horror at what the books looked like. But through the general election, we could all hear the Institute for Fiscal Studies, almost any economist you talk to, saying what the problem was with the books. You've got the OBR telling you on a regular basis what the books look like. There's something sort of performative, slightly contrived about this, because that's what it looks like to people.
Well, let me absolutely meet that head on. If you take one issue that's come up urgently, that's prisons, then I'm afraid what we found is much worse than what I was expecting. I'm deeply familiar.
Right? I mean, yet again,
I can tell you it's right.
The Prison Governors Association just put out a statement saying they told you what it was like.
No,
you had loads of talks beforehand.
Far
you knew
worse.
it was bad.
It's far worse. It is shocking. Obviously, I know this field pretty well, but it is a basic function of government to make sure that we have the prison places we need for those people who are being sent to prison by our courts. For that to have broken down is a catastrophic failure of the last government. It is a very high level of recklessness and irresponsibility. And I would say this is not, a party political issue. It's a basic function of government, and it's worse than we thought it would be.
You've appointed James Timpson as Prisons Minister. And that makes people think, yet again, there was stuff that you were saying in the election about clamping down and on crime and all the rest of it. You were doing the familiar rhetoric, the tough talk. But James Timpson is someone who believes that about a third of the people, particularly women, who are in prison shouldn't be there. There should be much more community sentencing, a sort of whole rethink of prisons, which you didn't talk about in the election. You just talked about building more prisons. Is that actually where you are? Are you much closer to James Timpson's thinking?
I spent 5 years of my life as the chief prosecutor, bringing cases which led to serious criminals going to prison for very long periods of time. I'm asking
about the others, though. Yeah.
In relation to the work that could be done to prevent people going to prison, I've always believed that there are cases which didn't need to have got to court.
So we do have...
And so, I mean, if you look at some of the stuff we're saying in the election about knife crime and tackling crime that's particularly prevalent among young people, we want youth hubs, which are an opportunity to pull young people out of that.
Absolutely, and that was in the manifesto. But what wasn't in the manifesto was a lot more community sentencing, many fewer people going into prisons. It sounded like you were going to send more to prison. You wanted to build more prisons. Is it actually that you think there are far too many people who get prison sentences who shouldn't get them, maybe particularly women?
Well, we're not conducting a review of sentencing. We're dealing with an immediate problem. Well, we're dealing with
So what's James Timpson doing there? He's got all these beliefs.
We're dealing with an immediate problem, which is that we've got too many prisoners for the prison places that we've got. That is a complete failure of the last government. We need to address that.
I'm being told my time is up. No rethink on sentencing.
Well, look, we will look at sentencing in the round, but the problem I'm addressing this week is not sentencing
Sounds like
policy.
There might be a rethink there.
Well, look, I'm not addressing the question of sentencing policy. I'm addressing something much more basic, which is that this government has left a complete mess when it comes to prisons, and we are going to have to pick that up. We're going to have to fix it, and yes, then we're going to have to look at what the long-term fix of that is. But the immediate problem they've left us is a very serious problem of too many prisoners for the number of prison places, and I can't build a prison overnight, as is obvious.
Prime Minister, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Gary talking to the Prime Minister. Well, joining me now is the former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, who stood down last summer and left the Commons at the election last week. Ben Wallace, thanks for coming on the programme again. You heard the Prime Minister there say, the new Prime Minister say 2.5% of GDP on defence, but no date. Should there be a date attached to that number?
Yeah, there has to be a date, because if there isn't, what will happen is the Treasury and the officials and the associated organisations such as the OBR and then other areas like the IFS, they would just simply ignore the rhetoric. They'll put it down to political rhetoric. They did that under our time, because ultimately there's two things that the Prime Minister needs to indicate if he's to be taken serious on this pledge, which is one, that he believes a greater share of the public sector spend needs to be spent on defence going forward. Jeremy Hunt said that in his first autumn statement. And then the second most important thing, as Gary Gibbon was there in his interview getting absolutely right in his questioning, that the sequencing is right, that you have the defence review, and I'm not there to tell them to have it in 3 months or 10 months or 6 months, but whatever it is, the review should report before the comprehensive spending review, e.g. the Treasury sets the overall government envelope of spending for the next 3 to 4 years. If that is out of sequence, and it has happened in 1998, it's happened many times before under Labour and Conservative governments, then what happens is it becomes a Treasury-led defence review, not a threat-led, and defence doesn't get the correct amount of money it needs.
OK, now 2.5% sounds quite ambitious, but of course, if Trump becomes president and goes wobbly on NATO, I mean, he might even threaten yet again to withdraw from it altogether, with the Americans spending more than 2/3 of the money on NATO in their coffers, then 2.5% is ridiculous. It needs to be much higher than that.
Well, I think what needs to define whatever we spend is the threat. And, you know, it's a worrying phrase that the Prime Minister went from, if you remember, economic conditions allow to our fiscal rules. So we're already seeing a bit of a change there. But it is low compared to what the Americans spend. You know, to be fair to Donald Trump, he is the same as Obama, who both said, they both set the 2% originally. Obama set it in 2014, that it's time Europe lifted some of the responsibility. 83% of the NATO defence spending are done by countries outside the EU. So 83%. And all Trump is saying and all Obama said was, hang on, guys, we're on the hook to send 340,000 United States servicemen and women to defend Europe. We're foregoing health or transport, whatever they're doing. You guys are having a very nice time selling gas to Russia. At the time, that's what Trump said to Merkel. You should spend more on defence. And there's no harm in that. And I think it's the right thing to do. And since then, Putin's become far more dangerous and direct towards Europe and countries in Europe. And so therefore, I'm afraid, just like parts of the Cold War, we're going to have to stand up, man up, be honest, that we might have to cut other parts of government to fund our defence and our deterrence.
But if the Americans spend a lot less on NATO because they're more interested in China, or if indeed they withdrew altogether, which is possible but not inevitable, then, for instance, Ukraine, which is a cause that you care very deeply about, they'll be thrown under the bus, won't they? We can't defend Ukraine without the Americans.
Well, first of all, the good news story on Ukraine is that Europe has already contributed collectively more to Ukraine than the United States. So it is not entirely impossible that if America froze out Ukraine, that Europe couldn't stand up and contribute more and assistance to Ukraine. I think that's really important. And what Putin fears the most is actually a united international community. And by the way, that actually sort of costs nothing. The best thing that the next United States president could do is say he supports the cause. He believes Ukraine, was illegally invaded and Russia should get out. But the actual sums of money and how much they want to put in, he should leave to be ambiguous. And keep the international community strong together. But Europe can do more if it wants to. We have some of the biggest economies on the world. It's whether we really want to.
OK, briefly and finally, I've got to ask you, I know you're not in Parliament anymore, but you are still a Tory. Where do you see your party heading and under whose leadership? A name, please.
Well, I'm not going to give you a name because the one thing I've been in opposition, I entered Parliament in 2005. The time we spend now in taking our time to reflect on what we've just been through and make sure that we work out, what we need to do next and take our time in bringing the Tory tribe back together will be time well spent for the future. I think if we rush into a leadership and we pick a leader at a very quick moment, that will not be either produce a good outcome and indeed could just make things worse. So I think the first thing is we need to recognise that, Labour are now the government. My point on defence here is actually about trying to help the Labour front bench in defence. The Labour ministers in defence, the Labour Ministry of Defence wants more money as well. They've said that on a number of occasions. I want good government. So people like you will focus on Keir Starmer. In the meantime, the Conservative Party shouldn't rush. There's going to be 3 or 4, 5 years till the next general election. And let's make sure we get it right.
OK, and since you've got time on that, just a yes or no answer. Could one of those names be Wallace? As in you?
Wallace is a Mr. Wallace now. I'm not even Parliament.
I don't know. You might get back in again.
Parliament. I take a decision.
OK. All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much, Ben Wallace. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Mark. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye.
Thanks. OK, all eyes yet again will be on Joe Biden this evening. Not so much the substance of what he says, but how he says it and how he appears when he says it at a press conference at the end of the NATO summit in Washington. It's the culmination of 3 days in which his every utterance has been scrutinized by concerned allies, gleeful opponents, and of course, American voters. And for Mr. Biden, the bad political news just keeps coming. Over to our Washington correspondent, Seth Kennedy, who is on Capitol Hill with the very latest. Seth.
Well, Matt, despite Nancy Pelosi yesterday telling her Democrats to lay off making any public statements about the president until the end of the NATO summit, today another member of the House, a congresswoman from Michigan, issued another statement saying that she believes Biden must pass the torch to a new candidate. She said that's 12 House members in total now, out of a total of 213. So still a small number, but those are the public ones, remember. And that followed the Democratic senator from Vermont last night becoming the first senator to say that he believed that Biden should step aside. And the list of woes, Matt, goes on, I have to say. In the last couple of hours, senators have been meeting with Biden campaign staff up on the Hill there behind me to discuss their urgent concerns about the president. On the way out of that meeting, Senator Manchin said that he believed that there would be a consensus about Biden by Sunday, and that tallied with what the Democratic House leader Hakeem Jeffries said in his press conference earlier. I was there, the gist of which was we Democrats in the House are urgently huddling together to discuss this situation, and we hope to come forward with some kind of conclusion as soon as possible. Let's hear what the leader said earlier.
Those conversations have been candid, comprehensive, and clear-eyed, and they continue. Until that process has concluded, I'm not going to address what any outside stakeholders may have to say about this matter.
So there is no doubt that the momentum seems to be moving against the president, despite the fact that he is carrying on with business as usual today, meeting with President Zelensky at the NATO summit there. But there is no doubt that he will face his toughest challenge yet tonight, as you said earlier, when he takes that press conference to mark the end of the NATO summit, where his every utterance and move will be scrutinized and analysed for evidence of his ability to carry on the job. It is an often used expression, Matt, but the stakes for Joe Biden literally could not be any higher.
Siobhan, thanks very much.